Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome. My name's Lauren. This is a true crime slash true story channel. If you're one of my already lovely subscribers, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate the support and I'm going to do my best to always put a video out weekly. Now, if you are new here, please like and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out a lot and it will really encourage me to continue to put out videos. It just tells me that I'm doing well. But of course, I will also take any feedback. Sorry, my cats are in the room again, as always. They always have to get their butt in shot. Now, today's case is another Australian case, and it actually happened back in my hometown of Melbourne, Victoria. For today's case, let's just get straight into it. So today's story starts in the suburb of Frankston in Melbourne. Frankston is a bayside suburb of Melbourne and it's located around 40 kilometres or 20 miles southeast of the central business district. It's a mixture of affluent areas and inexpensive council housing. It has a mixed reputation, with the northern area of the suburb being renowned for drug problems and crime. Now, when I was growing up and when I was really young in the 90s, Frankston, if you heard the name Frankston, you just did think drugs. Now, there are definitely parts, though, of Frankston that are really nice and wealthy. And being Bayside, it has like a beautiful stretch of, the beach and everything like that. So Frankston's one of those odd suburbs that has that bad reputation, but it's also surrounded by very affluent areas, wealthy areas. Now, the population is around 135,000 people. So we're going to talk about Alison Rook. So Alison Rook was a 60-year-old widow who resided on Hannah Street in the northern part of Frankston. And on Friday, May 30th, 1980, she was planning on going shopping she was planning on doing her weekly shop and she needed to go into town and pay her real estate bill. Now, Alison was a widow and she lived alone in an apartment and she had two or three grown adult children, but she lived alone. Now, when she got up that morning on the Friday to do her shopping and to pay bills, she went outside and her car wouldn't start. She was having car problems. So Alison decided that she would take the bus instead. And she lived only about a 100-meter walk from the Tynong freeway, which was it's the main freeway. It's a very busy road that runs through Melbourne and out of Melbourne, and you can actually take it all the way up the coast. So this is a very big freeway in Melbourne. It's one of the main ones. And she only lived about a 100-meter walk from there to the bus stop. Now, Alison was seen to leave her home by her neighbours at around 11 a.m. and start just the short walk up to the bus stop. Now, Alison never made it to the supermarket that day. She never placed a supermarket order and she never paid her real estate bill. Now, that evening, Alison's daughter Elaine had plans with Alison to go and see a concert or something at one of the local venues. And so she was calling her mother throughout the afternoon and into the very early evening to try to find out, when they were going to catch up or when she was going to pick her mother up. And the phone just kept ringing and ringing with no answer. Now, you got to remember, of course, this is 1980. There is no mobile phones. There is no social media. There's nothing. There's only landlines. So Elaine started to get concerned about her mum. Her mum was 60 years old and lived on her own. So she suddenly just started to have those thoughts of, what if mum has fallen over or something has happened to her in the apartment? And because she lives by herself, nobody's there to help her or assist her. She could be just laying there injured and no one's going to help her. So Elaine gets concerned enough to call her brother, Keith, and say to Keith, I think we should go around to the apartment and check on mum. Now, Elaine and Keith drive over to the apartment. They get there. They're knocking on the door. There's no answer. So Keith finally finds a window that he can open and climb through. And the two of them are sort of, they're bracing themselves to expect the worst, to find their mother, injured or something in the apartment. But they walk in and absolutely nothing is disturbed. Nothing's out of place. Everything is as it should be. But their mother, Alison, is not there. She's nowhere to be seen. And this is completely out of character. Alison doesn't have anywhere she needs to be. She wouldn't just disappear. She wouldn't go off anywhere for hours and hours during the day and just not show back up in the evening. It's just, especially when she had plans with her daughter, there is nowhere else that Alison needed to be. So they're immediately very worried and they call police. Now, police took this investigation immediately as being one of a lot of concern because of Alison's age and her lifestyle and her character. It didn't make any sense. Her children said this is just not something she would do. Something is very, very wrong. So police spoke to neighbours, and neighbours were the last witnesses. They said that they had seen Alison leave the home at 11 a.m. and she was just strolling down the street on her way to the bus stop. Police start an investigation and start asking around, has anyone else witnessed anything? Did anyone else witness anything on the main freeway where Alison was supposed to be catching the bus? Now, the bus driver who was driving the route that day, he couldn't recall picking Alison up, and no motorists came forward saying that they had seen Alison at the bus stop or had seen her getting into a car or anything like that. They hadn't seen a struggle. Nobody had witnessed anything. They had nowhere to go other than to say to Alison's children, we fear she has been abducted and taken against her will, but we don't know how that's happened. We don't know whether she's been dragged into a car or whether she's willingly got into a car with someone that she knows. Now, as far as I could tell, Alison's children didn't believe that Alison would ever get into a car willingly with a stranger, but police weren't sure because no one had witnessed a struggle, and this is on a busy main freeway where she was taken. Now, this investigation is ongoing, but with no leads and no witnesses, police have not really got anywhere to go with it. Now, that all changed on Saturday, the 5th of July, 1980. So around 5 weeks after Alison went missing, a dog walker, it's always a dog walker, found Alison's body. She was only a few kilometres from her home, and her body was found partially hidden by scrub on McCullen Drive in Frankston North. Now, McCullen Drive runs off of Skye Road, and it's not too far from where Alison actually lived. Now, Alison's body was found naked and heavily decomposed. There was items of hers, like her house keys, things like that were missing and have never been found. Now, police take Alison's body in for a post-mortem, but unfortunately, due to the state of decomposition, and again, this is the 1980s, DNA is in its very, very, in its infancy. I believe they had, blood typing back then, but that was virtually it. Her body was so badly decomposed, they couldn't determine a cause of death, and they couldn't determine whether Alison had been sexually assaulted, but finding her naked led them to believe that this was a sexually motivated crime. Now, police appealed to the public and were in fact very frustrated with the public that, more people weren't coming forward, or police felt like residents in the areas weren't taking this seriously. They said that everybody should be extremely concerned based on the way Alison has been abducted. This is someone who could very easily strike again, and it could be you that's next. Now, police set up 2 tip lines after Alison's abduction and body was found, and that she was found to be murdered. Police set up 2 tip lines to try to get witnesses or anyone with potential information to come forward. Nobody did. Nobody was said to have witnessed anything. But police were really afraid that they hadn't seen a crime like this in the area for a long time, and that this killer was very likely to strike again. Police also felt that this person was intelligent, and because they felt that Alison would have been quite reluctant to get in the car with a stranger, they were even thinking that Perhaps this person who's picked her up, because no one witnessed a struggle and it was a main road, maybe this person is even in some kind of a disguise, perhaps dressed as a woman, perhaps dressed as a priest, and somehow managed to convince someone of Alison's age at 60 that it was safe to get into the vehicle willingly. They also were saying that this was this person was clearly careful about how they had left the crime scene. They didn't leave any physical evidence of their own. They were very, very careful. However, even with these tip lines set up and police putting out these warnings in the newspapers for people to be aware of this crime, no leads, there were no leads and no arrests made. Now, roughly 3 months after Alison Rook's murder, another woman is abducted. So we're going to move to a suburb a bit of a further distance away called Glen Iris. Glen Iris is an affluent suburb in Melbourne, in the Melbourne's east, about 45 kilometres north of Frankston. And we're going to be talking about a woman named Bertha Miller. Now, Bertha Miller was a 75-year-old woman. She was a widow also, like Alison Rook. And Bertha was known to be a really, at 75, she was still very independent, in very good health, and she was retired and very heavily involved with her local church. So she was a very Christian woman. She went to church every single Sunday, and she also worked as the church's treasurer, and she also worked at the Sunday school with the children. So Bertha was described as a really humble woman and someone who was very selfless and really dedicated her life to others. And everybody liked Bertha a lot. Now, Bertha lived in an apartment in Glen Iris with her brother-in-law. Now, they weren't together, but I believe because Bertha Miller's husband had passed away, her brother-in-law was living with her just probably for company. So they weren't together, but they did share this apartment together. Now, on Sunday, the 10th of August, 1980, Bertha is doing her usual routine where she goes to church on the Sunday for the Sunday service. And so Bertha called out to her brother-in-law, who was in the bathroom in their apartment, and she just called out to him and said that she was off to church, which was her usual routine at exactly the same time every single Sunday. And she told him that, not to wait around to have lunch, that she was going to be there for most of the day and that she would be back later that afternoon. So Bertha set off at about 10:15 a.m. in order to catch the 10:47 tram. Now, this was the same tram she caught every single Sunday to go to the church service. And the tram stop was only around a 400-metre walk from her home. Now, Bertha set off outside, and the last witness to see her was a shop owner who had a shop on Bertha's route to the tram stop, and she said she saw Bertha just pass by her shop on the way to the tram stop. Now, Bertha had a friend who lived maybe 2 stops away from her who went to church with her as well every single Sunday. So Bertha would get on the tram at her stop, and then 2 stops later her friend would join her, and then they would travel in together on the tram and get off in Paran, which is a nearby suburb where their church was, and then they'd go into church together. Now, on this particular Sunday, Bertha's friend boarded the tram 2 stops after Bertha would have gotten on, and Bertha was nowhere to be seen. She was not on the tram. This is completely out of routine for Bertha, and Bertha was someone who was very about routine. But Bertha's friend isn't immediately concerned. She just thinks to herself, well, Bertha is the treasurer at the church, and she also runs the Sunday school at the church as well. So her friend thinks, okay, well, maybe Bertha's decided to get an earlier tram to do some business at the church. So her friend doesn't think too much of it. However, Bertha never shows up to church that day. She's not there for the service. She's not there for Sunday school. And this immediately raises red flags. Now, when she also doesn't return, the brother-in-law gets concerned as well, and police are called. Now, this is when it really hits police because Bertha Miller is actually the auntie of the chief police commissioner at this time, Mick Miller. It's his auntie that's actually disappeared. Now, again, like Alison's disappearance, Bertha's is immediately treated as suspicious as well and very concerning. Again, she's a 75-year-old woman. She has no reason to vanish or disappear or to go off on her own. Absolutely none. It's just never, it is not something that she would ever do. So police are immediately very, 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 very concerned and they start an investigation. Now, I have to also say that even though I'm talking about, or I just talked about Alison's, Bertha's disappearance was not linked to Alison's at all. These are two different investigations, different police dealing with them. So I just want to make that clear that Bertha's disappearance is not linked to Alison's at this point in time at all. So police start an investigation. Now, like I said before, Bertha had left at 10:15 in the morning, which was her usual routine to get the 10:47 a.m. tram. She had been seen walking to the tram stop, which is about a 400-metre walk. Whether she made it to the tram stop is now doubtful. But once again, this is a suburb where people are around. It's 10:15 a.m. But once again, there's no witnesses. Nobody saw anything. After that shopkeeper said that they had seen Bertha walking down the street, there were no other witnesses. Nobody saw Bertha get dragged into a car. Nobody witnessed a struggle. Nobody witnessed her leaning in and talking to a driver on the side of the road. No one witnessed a thing. Bertha had, just like Alison, vanished off of the footpath, and no one saw a thing. So once again, frustratingly, police have an investigation going and they have no leads. They have nowhere to go. They don't have a car to go off of. They don't have witnesses. They don't have anything. Bertha's vanished. Now, 18 days later, after Bertha went missing, a girl goes missing in the suburb of Berwick. Berwick is a little more southeast of Glen Iris and northeast of Frankston. Now, Berwick at this point in time in 1980 was a very rural suburb. It had only just started to have housing developments, etc. So it was very sort of like still a lot of bush around and everything like that. It was just more of a rural suburb. It was further out, as you can see on the map. It was further out than the other suburbs, but it wasn't too far away. It was still sort of like within that part of Melbourne. And we're going to be talking about Catherine Headland. Catherine Headland was a 14-year-old who lived with her mother and her brother. Now, Catherine was a really popular girl at school. Her main passion was competing in local competitions with her beloved horse, Prince. Catherine absolutely adored her horse, Prince. I believe she was riding pretty much all of the time. Catherine's other interest was basically just socialising, and she also had a boyfriend named John who was of similar age to her, 14 to 15 years old. Catherine was told by her mother that Prince, her horse, was becoming expensive. So he was an expensive hobby for her to have, as all of you would know. Horse ownership, as I would know, I'm big into horses, was a very expensive hobby to have, and especially like competition and upkeep and feed. And I believe Catherine's mother was a single mum, so it was really difficult for her to pay for Prince. So Catherine's mother tells her that she really needs Catherine to get a job, like a part-time job just outside of school, and to help pay for Prince's upkeep, or her mother would unfortunately need to sell him. Now, Catherine's heartbroken at the idea of selling Prince. She adores him. So Catherine agrees with her mother that she will get a part-time job. Now, her mum worked at the Coles supermarket, which was in a shopping centre called Fountain Gate, and it wasn't very far from where they lived. And her mother helped Catherine get a weekend job helping out at the supermarket as well. So Catherine's got a job now at working at the supermarket. Now, on Thursday, the 28th of August, 1980, it's school holidays, and Catherine has accepted a couple of extra shifts like during the week, considering she's currently not at school. Catherine's due to start work on this particular day at 12 a.m. So her mother gets up really early that morning at around 8:30 a.m. and goes to work herself. And she leaves Catherine some money so that Catherine can get the bus to work later on that morning. Now, Catherine gets up and leaves at around 9:30 a.m. and makes the 1 mile walk to her boyfriend John's house. And he's there just chilling out with a few of their other friends because it's school holidays, parents are at work. So they were just hanging out at John's house listening to records and things like that. So Catherine goes around so that she can get some social time and get to see her boyfriend before she has to go to work. Now, when Catherine arrives there, she hangs out with her friends and her boyfriend for a little while. And she even says to friends that she's getting a little bit tired of her part-time job. You know, it's interfering with her social life. I can imagine at 14, your social life is everything aside from her horse. So she's frustrated that, this job's interfering. But of course, she's torn because she knows she needs to have this job in order to fund her other passion and her horse, which she absolutely adores. So at around 11:10 a.m., Catherine leaves her boyfriend John's house, and there are a few other friends that are there. She says goodbye to everybody. Because she needs to get the bus at 11:20 a.m. And the bus stop was 100 meters, I believe, around 100 meters from John's house on the same street. So Catherine gets up, and now I believe John was actually not very well. He was lying on the sofa and feeling a bit unwell at this point. So he simply says to Catherine, see you later. And he doesn't get up and walk her outside, which is something that he would usually do. So she just leaves, and she's like, but it's 11:10 a.m. on a Thursday morning. So nobody's concerned about Catherine walking to 100 meters to the bus stop where her bus is coming literally in 10 minutes. Catherine walks down to the bus stop. Now, whether Catherine makes it to the bus stop, we don't know, but Catherine never shows up to work that day. The bus driver could not recall whether he had picked Catherine up, but Catherine never shows up, and Catherine is not seen again. So once again, police are called and immediately start up another investigation. But once again, police have nothing. Nobody saw anything. Nobody saw Catherine standing at the bus stop. No witnesses had seen her board the bus. The bus driver didn't remember her getting on the bus. And nobody on the street had heard anything, had heard a struggle, had heard any kind of disturbance outside where the bus stop is. Nobody had seen Catherine talking to anybody. Nobody had seen anything. Once again, Catherine had vanished off of the street in the middle of the day, within a 10-minute period of catching her bus. However, in Catherine's investigation, witnesses did come forward. However, this kind of confused the investigation, if anything, because the witnesses who did come forward who knew Catherine or believed they had seen someone who matched Catherine's description, because what police did was they put a mannequin out at the bus stop where Catherine had been due to catch the bus and dressed it in her clothes, etc., and left it there to try and jog people's memories to see if they could remember anything. Now, witnesses did come forward saying that they really believed that they had seen Catherine that day, but that they had seen her in other areas of Melbourne, in an area called Narre Warren, which is further away from where she was, and that she was seen with a blonde girl later on that afternoon. Now, this didn't make sense. It just didn't make sense at all. Catherine would have just not... she was already at her boyfriend's and realising that she needed to leave there in order to go to work. Why would she then ditch work, go to a suburb that she doesn't know with an unknown person? And this blonde girl never came forward, was never identified. So pretty quickly, police had to rule that these sightings just weren't reliable and that they couldn't take it into consideration, and that they actually believed that Catherine wasn't seen after that morning, after she left John's, that she did vanish either on the way to that bus stop or once she got to that bus stop, someone had taken her. Just a month after Catherine's disappearance, another woman goes missing. On the 6th of October 1980, 18-year-old Anne Marie Sargent goes missing. Now, Anne Marie Sargent was an 18-year-old woman, and she lived in the suburb called Cranbourne. Cranbourne is located almost centrally between Frankston, where Alison Rook disappeared from and her body was later found, and Berwick, where Catherine Headland had disappeared from. Now, Anne Marie Sargent was described as a really bubbly girl with a large group of friends. She was currently unemployed at the time and struggling to know what she wanted to do for a career and for a job. She wasn't living with family at this time. She had moved out and was living with family friends. Now, on this day, the 6th of October, 1980, I believe it was like a Thursday or a Friday, so once again, it's a weekday. All of the women so far have gone missing on weekdays. So all of them have gone missing on a Thursday or a Friday at this point, and I believe this day was a Thursday or a Friday as well. Now, Anne Marie was visiting her mother, and she was at her mother's house in Cranbourne at around 9:30 a.m. She then just tells her mother that she's going to leave and go to the unemployment office, which was only a short distance away in Tynong. So it was around 15 kilometres away, where she was going to go and lodge her unemployment benefit check. So she leaves her mother's address at around 9:30, and she told her mother she was going to go to the unemployment office, lodge the form, and then she'd make her way back to her mother's that afternoon to pick up some clothes and things like that she still had at her mother's address. So Anne Marie Sargent makes it to the unemployment office in Tynong, and she lodges the form that's on the unemployment office's records that she was there and she was seen there. However, after Anne Marie Sargent leaves that office, she vanishes. She's never seen again. And this was around mid-morning, midday that she has vanished. So again, police are called later that day when Anne Marie doesn't arrive back at home, or she doesn't arrive back anywhere and she's missing. Police once again start another investigation. Again, none of these women missing are linked or anything like that at this stage. They're all separate investigations. They're all treated as separate disappearances, but they're all treated as abductions at this point in time. Now, the only difference with Anne Marie's disappearance is that her father came forward to police and said Anne Marie was someone who occasionally would hitchhike. So again, this is 1980 and Melbourne was a much smaller city back then, and these are more rural areas at this point in time. So hitchhiking was definitely not an uncommon thing that people did. I'm not saying that it's a great idea to hitchhike. We all know that it's not an ideal thing to do, but a lot of people back then felt a little bit safer, or they did feel safer doing it. And especially if you were doing it probably during the day, you would feel safer. Again, I'm not condoning hitchhiking. I don't think you should ever hitchhike unless you're abandoned in a desert somewhere and you're going to die. Otherwise, I just don't think, I don't think you should hitchhike. I'm definitely not saying that. But it was said that Anne Marie was. So this was the only thing that police needed to take into consideration with Anne Marie's case, was that once again, they had no witnesses to Anne Marie being approached whilst leaving the unemployment office or walking to the closest transport. But Anne Marie was known to also not have money on her that day to get public transport. And because she was unemployed and quite often was, very low on money, she would have to rely on walking, which her father said she was quite happy to do. She loved walking and she would walk great distances, but that on the odd occasion, if someone pulled over, offered her a lift, and she felt safe enough, she would accept, and her family knew that she did do that. So this was the one thing that police did have to take into consideration, that more than likely no one would have witnessed a struggle with Anne Marie, because she quite possibly willingly would have gotten into a car if someone had pulled over. However, once again, nobody had witnessed a car pulling over or talking to Anne Marie, and no one really even knew at what location she was abducted from. or taken in a car? Was it just outside the unemployment office? Was it further along her walk back to Cranbourne? We don't know exactly. It was a 15-kilometre distance between her mother's home in Cranbourne and the unemployment office in Dandenong. So we don't know at what point she went missing. And no one really even came forward and said that they had seen her walking. Literally, the last people to have said they saw her were the people in the unemployment office. She vanishes. No leads, no witnesses, nothing again. Now, almost 2 months later, after Anne-Marie Sargent went missing, yep, you guessed it, another woman goes missing. So we're going to talk about Nirmal Stevenson. Now, Nirmal was a 34-year-old woman. She was originally from Thailand, and she had married a man, an Australian man named Wayne Stevenson, who was a dairy farmer. And he had a dairy farm outside of Melbourne, so they didn't actually live in Melbourne. They lived on a farm outside of Melbourne. So Nirmal had married Wayne Stevenson in Thailand in 1978. They lived on a farm, a dairy farm, because Wayne Stevenson was a dairy farmer in Deans Marsh, which is 134 kilometres southwest of Melbourne. Nirmal was struggling to fit in Australia. She was said by people who knew her and by her family back in Thailand that quite quickly she was almost regretting her decision of moving to Australia, and I don't believe their marriage was also working out, even though they'd been married only a short time, only a few years. She was really, really struggling, and I can only imagine the idea of moving to Australia was probably, sounded idyllic, but moving to a farm out in a rural area where you don't know anyone and you don't have any family or friends around, for Nirmal would have been really, really tough. Her family was said to say that she was telling them that she was already a bit regretful that she had made this decision. Now, on the 28th of November 1980, Wayne and Nirmal Stevenson decide they're going to travel into Melbourne to visit with some of Wayne's friends and also attend a concert. Now, they stay overnight on the 28th with some friends in Camberwell. Camberwell sits between Glen Iris and only 3.5 kilometres from where Bertha Miller went missing in Glen Iris. And Bertha Miller had gone missing only 10 weeks earlier. The following day, on the 29th, they visited another friend in the suburb of Brunswick. Now, Brunswick's only 11 miles away in the inner north of Melbourne. Now, upon arriving in Brunswick in Melbourne, Nirmal and Wayne, they get into a disagreement. Now, what had happened was Nirmal had actually visited a local market earlier that day on the 29th, and she had bought all the ingredients, and she really wanted to make a lovely Thai dinner for Wayne and his friends that they were visiting in Brunswick. But instead, Wayne and his friends had gone out drinking at the pub. So Nirmal understandably was annoyed when they're late and skip her cooking this meal for them, and they come back to the apartment and she's had to sit there while they all drink. Why you go to the pub and give up a Thai meal is beyond me, but anyway, and understandably, I'd be pissed too. So Nirmal, she digs her heels in. She tells Wayne that she's not going to get out of the car. She's annoyed and she's not going to go into the apartment and join them in the friend's apartment in Brunswick. She just sits in the car. She's pissed. Understandably. Wayne goes upstairs into the apartment that late evening and he just continues to socialise with his friends while Nirmal sits in the car annoyed. Wayne says that, of course, throughout the evening, he went down to check on Nirmal a number of times because she was literally just sitting in the car, which was on a reasonably main road outside of this apartment block. And he said the first time he came down and checked on her that evening, she was just sitting in the car, still unprepared to come into the apartment. She was still really annoyed with all of them. And I think she just didn't want a part of, not only was she annoyed with them basically wasting her going out and shopping and getting all of this food to make a nice meal, and they got drunk instead, or they were drinking. She's also just not wanting to be a part of it. She's just not wanting to be a part of whatever socializing was going on up in this apartment. Now, the second time Wayne says he came down to check on Nirmal, he said that she was outside of the car this time and she was actually walking back towards him. And he didn't say that it was definite, but he believes that she'd gone up to the local, like the nearby 7-Eleven, like the, convenience stores. Whether she'd bought a snack or something like that, we don't know. But then he just says that she was out of the car and walking back towards him. Once again, she gets back into the car and says to him, I'm not coming upstairs. Not going to happen. Wayne goes back upstairs to continue socializing. Now, no one says that they were intoxicated or anything like that. It's clear that they had been drinking, but Wayne sort of says that they were just having a social evening together as friends, and it was, drinking coffee, things like that as well. It wasn't like a party or something like that. But Nirmal continues to sit downstairs in the car, refusing to get out and go upstairs. Now, Wayne says that really late that evening, so it must have been either around midnight or somewhere around then. It's quite late by this stage, or maybe even the early hours of the morning. He goes downstairs again because she's still not left the car. This is the third time he's checked on her, and he says this time she's outside of the car again, and he says that she was talking to someone, a man, in a car, and that she was talking in Thai to him, and he was speaking back to her, not in Thai, but he had a European accent, or a thick European accent. Why she was speaking Thai, we don't know. Wayne just said that that's what was happening. Now, I think at this time, Wayne gets concerned that she's talking to somebody in a car. So he makes a decision that he's going to sit in the car with her. So they get back into the car. She's still annoyed. She's still not prepared to come upstairs. He's asked her if she will come upstairs because it's so late or into the wee early morning. And she's still like, no, I'm not coming upstairs. I'm staying in the car. So she's basically decided at this point she's sleeping in the car. And Wayne decides that he's not going to leave her. He's going to stay in the car. So they both sit in the car, and Wayne says it's almost dawn, so around 5 o'clock in the morning or something like that, that he gets tired and he says to her finally, like, are you going to come upstairs? Nirmal's not having it. No, she's not coming upstairs, so he goes upstairs. He said he laid down and fell asleep. Then he says he wakes up at around 6 o'clock in the morning and goes back downstairs to check on Nirmal, and this is when Nirmal's gone. She's vanished. She's nowhere to be seen. The car is there. There's no disturbance around the car or inside the car. There's no sign of a struggle, nothing. Nirmal's just gone, vanished. Not to be seen again. Police are called, but this time Wayne comes to police and says to police, he's very honest with them, and he says, look, we did have a disagreement. It wasn't like a major fight or anything like that, but in all honesty, we'd had a falling out and she was annoyed at me and she had decided she was staying in the car that night and she wouldn't come upstairs. She just refused. So based on this information, police aren't sure whether to treat this investigation as a missing, potentially abducted person, or whether to consider that Nirmal's potentially just left on her own accord, like that she's not happy in the marriage. Her family have said that she's not happy in Australia. Has Nirmal just gone off and started again somewhere else, or something to that effect? Basically, it's not treated at this point that she has been abducted. Once again, there is no witnesses. Nobody saw Nirmal get out of the car. As in, like, nobody, after Wayne left her at like close to dawn and she was still sitting in the car, nobody else has seen her. Nobody else on the street saw her. Nothing. Nobody heard anything. Nothing. As of between 4:30 or 5 a.m. and 6 a.m., within that hour, Nirmal vanished. Now, like I said earlier, none of these missing women, none of them at all, had been connected, and none of them had been connected to the abduction and murder of Alison Rook. So far, none of these other women have been linked. They're all just missing at this point, and they're all separate investigations. However, 1 week after Nirmal's disappearance, that would all change. On the 6th of December 1980, around 40 kilometres or 25 miles, there is an area called Tynong North. Now, Tynong North is a very small rural farming area. So the population, I believe, is about 400 people, and it's just farming and bushland, dense bushland. There is nothing else around really at all. And 3 farmers who lived in the area had spent that morning slaughtering animals. Horrible, but that's what farmers do. And they realised that the parts of the animals that they weren't going to use or weren't edible, they needed to dispose of it. Now, it's not easy to find places to dispose of that where it's not going to then, decompose and smell. So one of the farmers stays behind, and he's going to take all of the carcasses of the animals and put them into the freezer. And the other 2 men load up the parts that they're not going to be using, that aren't edible, and they're going to find somewhere to dispose of them. So they drive to an area of Tynong North, 2 kilometres off of the Princess Freeway, which runs through Tynong. You drive up this road, Bruce Road, and you kind of hit like a dead end, and there's like a quarry off to the right, and then there's just bushland to the left. And there's all these wallaby tracks. Now, wallabies, if you're not familiar with the native animal wallabies in Australia, they're like a smaller version of kangaroos. They look very much like kangaroos, but they're not kangaroos. They're called wallabies, but they look kind of similar. Now, there's wallaby tracks everywhere. So this is a very, very rural, dense area. So it's basically not where anyone goes walking. There's literally animal tracks, but not walking tracks. It's heavily populated also by snakes. Now, of course, again, in Australia, we have very dangerous snakes out in the bush. So bushwalking around there where there's lots of snakes and it's not safe to walk around there, you're not going to be out there, going for a jog or walking your dog. So it's a very isolated place. So these 2 men who have these carcasses the leftovers of these animals have decided, like, this is a perfect place to dispose of them. It's not going to bother anybody whilst it decomposes. It's just going to go back into the ground. And also the wildlife, like the foxes and the wild dogs in the area, will take care of the remains of these animals. So they park the car at this dead end, and they both walk off onto a trail into the bush near where the quarry is. Now, the quarry is a disused quarry. It's not used anymore, and it's actually filled with water now. One of the men is walking along one of these trails, and this is when he suddenly looks to his right. Now, his friend just hears him call out, "Oh my God, I have found a body. There is a body laying out here." He then said that he just walked that bit closer just to have another look. And this is when he calls back out to his friend and says, "Actually, no, there's 2. There's 2 bodies here." Now, they didn't know it at the time, and it would be confirmed a few days later. They had actually stumbled across the bodies of Bertha Miller, who vanished in Glen Iris, Melbourne, and Anne Marie Sargent, the 18-year-old who went missing in Dandenong. They were lying literally side by side. Now, Anne Marie Sargent was naked. Bertha Miller was actually, however, still fully dressed, basically. They were both heavily decomposed. They weren't buried. They were just laying there, sort of concealed by scrubland or the undergrowth, but they weren't buried. They were both lying on their backs, face up, with one arm over their chest and one arm by their side. They were positioned side by side, head to feet, in exactly the same position. These men freak out, as you can imagine, and they call police. Police immediately come and are there and start to seal off the entire area, and they start looking. There's 2 bodies here. 2 bodies of 2 women who had never even been linked to one another. Now, the following morning, so the 7th of December 1980, whilst the police are combing the entire area around where Bertha and Anne-Marie had been found, only 15 metres away, they find a third body. And within a couple of days, this body is identified as 14-year-old Catherine Headland, who had gone missing shortly after Bertha had gone missing, but before Anne-Marie Sargent had gone missing. And she's only 15 metres away. She's heavily decomposed as well. She's naked and she's not buried. She's lying face up as well, and she's just near a tree. Immediately, the investigation completely changes. Police are like, we've got 3 missing women who we never even considered ever being linked, are now linked. And it's got to be the same person. It's got to be the same perpetrator who has abducted and killed all 3 of these women. Now, I'm saying women. I know I shouldn't be. Catherine Headland was not a woman. She was a 14-year-old adolescent child, she was a very young teenager, which makes this even more upsetting. I am going to say women while I'm talking because it's just going to be a lot easier than saying 5 women and a girl, but she was a girl, and we have to remember that makes it so much, it does make it worse. It's disturbing that she was just 14 years old. So now the investigation intensifies. Police suddenly realize that they need to sort of gather a task force because suddenly they have a serial killer on their hands, and it seems to be the one person. Now, at the moment, they've just linked these 3 women. However, they now start to consider that the first victim, Alison Rook, who went missing and found murdered in Frankston North, some police start to think, are these 4 connected? Because now there was a lot of debate about this. A lot of people didn't, like, a lot of police felt like it potentially was. Some thought it wasn't. But whenever they were talking about, they started to refer to this as the Tynong North murders. They would also start to mention the Frankston murder. So they were still considering that Alison Rook's murder could potentially be linked to the other 3 women who have now been found together in Tynong North. So, and the reason why they're also connecting all of these now, especially these 4 at the moment, is because they were all abducted the same way. They were all taken in the middle of the day, Alison Rook as well, all whilst they were waiting for public transport or on their way to get public transport. They were all found disposed of in a similar way. Like, none of them were buried. Alison Rook wasn't buried either. She was found off of that road in Frankston North. I believe it was called Sky Road and McCallum Drive. She was found there in Scrubland, just off of that road by that dog walker. And she was found just lying there naked as well, and not buried, but just sort of hidden in scrubland, like with some branches. And that's exactly how the other 3 women were found as well. So this is all making police think that this could be linked. It could be, even though their bodies were found here and Alison's body was found there. It's still reasonably close proximity in close suburbs that, like, it's almost like making a full circle, because Bertha Miller, and she lived enough of a distance away from Catherine Headland and from Anne-Marie Sargent, but still, the 3 of them have clearly been taken by the same person. Why wouldn't the same person have taken Alison Rook? Now, they realise also that this makes it very difficult because this person doesn't appear to have a type of victim. He seems to be more of an opportunist than a planned, meticulous, someone who would stalk victims and choose a particular victim or a particular age or look. He was more someone who appeared to just see opportunity and take women when he could. He was also taking women during the day, which made police think he was either an unemployed man or someone who worked night shift or evening shifts. They believe it was sexually motivated, but they were a little confused on that because Bertha Miller was found completely dressed. However, all the other victims were naked, which made them believe it was sexually motivated in some way. But of course, all of the bodies so far were so heavily decomposed that they couldn't establish whether they had been sexually assaulted. And also, sadly, even after doing postmortems on the 3 victims that were found in Tynong North, Catherine Headland, Anne-Marie Sargent, and Bertha Miller, once again, a cause of death couldn't be determined. They were just too heavily decomposed. So there's an investigation launched. A task force of around 25 police officers are now working the Tynong North case. So we've got the 3 bodies there and Alison Rook as well. So there's 4 women who have been found and are sort of linked, but at the moment a lot of them are still treating the investigations as being separate. Alison Rook in Frankston North and the 3 Tynong North murders. At this point in time, Niramal Stevenson, she's still missing. So they started to try and put like a profile together. They also asked for any women to come forward who had been offered lifts, especially during the day and whilst they were waiting or on their way to get public transport. They also set up roadblocks and questioned people. And this is where a couple of suspects also started to come in. So police, in its entirety of this investigation, interviewed almost 2,000 men and narrowed it down slowly but surely. They narrowed it down to 3 suspects, with 1 being the prime suspect. Now, I'm not going to talk about them just yet because there is a little bit more to go into first, but I will come back and we will talk about those 3 suspects and why they have become the main persons of interest. Police were investigating. There was task force set up. There was appeals made for women to come forward. And this is when women did start to come forward and talk about a Toyota Corolla black panel van that looks similar to this, and that this car had been known or seen with a male driver who had been offering them lifts. I just want to say that the investigation was, the police were really trying everything they could do because they had no DNA, they had no physical evidence left by the killer, they had no witnesses who had seen these women getting into the cars or talking to people in the cars. So it was really, the police had very little to work on. And you got to remember, this is 1980. There's no CCTV. No one can be tracked via their phones or their phone apps. Police are really heavily relying on witnesses, like the public, to come forward who have seen anything and experienced anything suspicious, and just nothing's happening. Now, whilst the Tynong North murder investigation is going on and then the separate semi-linked investigation of Alison Rook going on, about 10 months after the 3 women in Tynong North's bodies were found, another woman goes missing. Joy Summers was a 55-year-old widow who lived only 1 kilometre away from where the first victim, Alison Rook, had lived. They literally lived around the corner from one another. They didn't know each other, but they lived very close to one another. Now, Joy had suffered from arthritis and had also had a stroke. So every Friday when she would do her weekly shop, she was accompanied by a friend to help her do her shopping. However, on Friday, the 9th of October, 1981, her friend had a few medical appointments and he couldn't assist Joy to the shops that day. So I believe he used to drive her and take her because she didn't like shopping alone and she didn't feel comfortable. So on this particular day, he couldn't go with her, yet Joy made the decision to go to her butcher's that she really liked going to because she wanted a specific cut of meat. Now, when her friend tells her that he can't accompany her that day, she realizes that she's also going to have to get the bus that day from basically the same road and area as Alison Rook had gone to get the bus. So Joy was seen leaving her home shortly after 1 p.m. By neighbours, and was seen walking it to the bus stop, which again was only about 100 metres away on that main Dandenong highway. And she was actually seen at around 1:20 p.m. standing at the bus stop. However, after that last sighting, again, she was not seen. She didn't make it to the butcher's that day. She didn't pick up any meat or place any orders. She never came home, and the bus driver didn't recall having picked Joy Summers up from that bus stop. Now, 6 weeks later, on Sunday, the 22nd of November, 1981, the body of Joy Summers was found. And it was found on the intersection, or close to the intersection, in some scrubland of Sky Road and McCullen Drive. Now, if you remember back to the beginning of this video when I was talking about Alison Rook, she was found further up on McCullen Drive as well. Now, Joy Summers was found. She was naked. She was not buried. She was just left sort of in with, the undergrowth and the scrubland just concealing her body. And she was only 3 kilometres away from where Alison Rook's body had been found. So both of these women had been once again abducted. And this made police then immediately think, okay, well, we've definitely got the same killer for Alison Rook and Joy Summers. But a lot of police were starting to think that there were 2 serial killers working the area, whereas other police were like, is it really likely to have 2 serial killers in the same area who start up around the same time? Like, is that plausible? I mean, it could happen. But, some were like, I really think it's the one. I think it's because of the way they were abducted and the way they were found. Now, I also should mention that because all of the bodies were in advanced state of decomposition, it was believed by the coroner that all of these 5 women now that have been murdered and found were murdered and disposed of the same day they were abducted. Once again, with Joy Summers, however, sadly, it had been 5 weeks. And like the other bodies, she'd been out in the elements, exposed to wildlife, rain. So she was heavily decomposed as well. And they couldn't determine, once again, a cause of death or if she'd been sexually assaulted. But once again, she was naked. So they assumed it had a sexual element to it, like the other murders. Bertha Miller, at this point in time, was the only victim that had been found clothed. Now, all of the women as well, police were finding as they spoke to families and loved ones, that all of the women were missing personal items as well. Now, police have never come forward and said what those personal items are. Now, of course, their clothes were removed, but that's believed due to possibly a sexual motive, or also to try and make it harder to identify the women. But Bertha Miller was dressed. Other items were missing though, like Alison Rook's keys were missing. Police did admit to that. But it's believed that the women were missing personal items of jewellery and things like that as well. Now, some jewellery was left behind. Some jewellery and things we believe was taken. Police, like I said, won't confirm those details, but because, of course, the killer knows. So they want to keep that to themselves so that if the killer ever admits it, they will know that they're talking to the right person. Now, once again, of course, with Joy Summers' abduction, they're stuck. They've got no leads, nothing, and no one witnessed anything. Now, I'm going to go back to the investigation because this was all going on around the same time as just before Joy Summers was abducted and murdered and just afterwards. So now we've got 5 bodies, the 2 in Frankston North and the 3 in Tynong North. Nirmal's Stevenson's body has not yet been discovered. She is still a missing person. So police, over this period of time with this task force that they had set up, they had interviewed around 2,000 or just under 2,000 men. And this had come from leads, the only leads they had, which was based on Once they appealed for women to come forward and tell them if they had been approached by anyone offering them lifts, what the cars looked like, had they seen anyone suspicious in the area driving around. This is when some witnesses came forward and mentioned the black panel van that had been offering lifts, and they managed to track that individual down. And surprisingly enough, or interestingly enough, he lived right near Alison Rook and Joy Summers in Frankston North at this time. And he'd been living there for several years. He had also worked on the street of Sky Road where their bodies were found. And we're going to get a little bit more into him later. But yeah, he's one of the suspects. He's actually the prime suspect. Now, due to court proceedings or like a court order that was put in, none of these three men at the time could be named. Now, to this day, the prime suspect, recently in 2017, he has been named, but I'm not going to name him in this because I'm not really sure if I'm supposed to. You can certainly Google articles on the Frankston and Tynong North murders and the suspects, and you will get him come up and his name, etc. But for this, I'm just going to refer to him as the prime suspect. So we'll get into the first suspect, and then I'll finish with the third being the prime. So the first suspect police had was a man they referred to as the Miller's suspect. Now, the reason they called him the Miller's suspect because, as I said earlier in the video, the chief commissioner at the time was the nephew of Bertha Miller, one of the victims. Now, this was his suspect that he felt the most confident about being the most likely. This suspect had an alibi for when Catherine Headland and Anne Marie Sargent were abducted. That was the only reason at the time when they were doing all the interviews that he was ruled out. But the reason why he was sort of still remaining a really high level suspect was because at the time where he worked in a factory. He could have falsified his alibi. So at that time, they had handwritten timesheets for working at the factory, and they had a time card. Now, when the investigators looked into it, it was seen and disclosed by the employer that employees would quite often lie on their time cards. So they would get either another employee to punch their time card for them or to write in what time they were there. And some employees would leave during the day for like hours at a time or not come into work at all. So employees were doing this, which made this suspect, even though it appeared that he had worked the days that Catherine Headland and Anne-Marie Sargent went missing, he could have lied. It could have been written in there for him. And so that made a number of investigators feel like he doesn't really have an alibi or a strong alibi. It's not airtight. The other reason that made him a very probable suspect was he knew Catherine Headland. He had friends who were linked to Anne-Marie Sargent, and he was indirectly linked to Bertha Miller. Now, this made him, of course, interesting because it means that he could have potentially gotten Catherine Headland into his car without a struggle if she knew him. He could have also potentially picked up Anne-Marie Sargent without a struggle, and Bertha Miller, who they all said was even less likely to get into a car with someone that she didn't know. Now, suspect number 2. This was a suspect that only came onto the radar because of a Christmas card that was sent to Catherine Headland's family and a letter, a typed letter that had been sent to the chief commissioner. It got his attention because this person knew a lot about the murders and also mentioned items that had been taken from a couple of the victims, which made then the police commissioner think, and the police investigating the case, that whoever wrote this letter and the Christmas card was either the killer or knew the killer. Now, they of course went in and investigated it, and because the letter was typed, in the end, it got narrowed down. I don't know how they narrowed it down to Pentridge Prison in Melbourne, but they did. They took 3 typewriters from that prison and matched the typewriter from that prison to the letters, or to the letter that had been sent to the police commissioner. And this is when they realised that an inmate serving time at Pentridge Prison had written the letter and the Christmas card. Now, they pull him aside, of course, and are like, what's this about? Now, they quickly rule out that because he's been serving time, he's not responsible. He's ruled out of being responsible for any of the murders and the deaths, but he's a serial rapist and he's been in prison for some time. As far as we know, he hadn't murdered anybody, but he was a serial rapist. Horrible person. But he was serving time with another infamous person. So this person's name was Raymond Edmonds. Now, because I'm talking about Raymond Edmonds now, I'm going to cover him next week. Raymond Edmonds was, or is, a really horrible person. There is no way of putting it. He was serving time in prison in 1989 because he'd been convicted for the rape and murders of 2 teenagers in 1966. However, he hadn't been caught and convicted of those rapes and those murders till 1985, meaning that he was out and about whilst all of these women were abducted. Now, he was convicted for 2 murders. However, police believed he was responsible for a number of other murders and at least over 30 rapes between 1966 and to when he was caught in 1985. So I will talk about him next week because I'm mentioning him now. But this inmate had been serving time with Raymond Edmonds and that he believed very strongly that Raymond Edmonds was responsible for these murders that had happened in Frankston North and the Tynong North. Police, of course, did believe that this was, of course, a potentially good lead. He had, some knowledge of the murders, and it seemed like Raymond Edmonds may have had quite a bit of information on the murders. So they look into Raymond Edmonds' background around 1980 and 1981 when these 5 or 6 women were abducted. But there becomes a little bit of a problem. So right around when the murders started, Raymond Edmonds had actually moved interstate to New South Wales, so where Sydney is. And that would have made it difficult for him to commit the abductions and the murders. It would have meant that he would have had to have travelled back in and out of New South Wales to Victoria, back and forth to commit the murders and the abductions. Now, it's not impossible, but police just, they just didn't think he would have done that. So as much as Raymond Edmonds is an evil man, he's evil, and we will get into him next week, evil, Raymond Edmonds will not cooperate with police at all. Nothing. Not on any of the other rapes and murders that he's suspected of, other than what he's been convicted for. He won't cooperate with that investigation, which is already the investigation that was on him, or the Tynong North and Frankston North investigation. He wants no part of it. He says he's not responsible for any of it. And he won't cooperate with police. He won't talk to them about any cold cases as far as that's what he says. He's not interested. I won't talk about his sentencing or how long he's serving time because I'm going to talk about Raymond Edmonds next week. This brings us to the red hot suspect, or the prime suspect in this entire investigation. Now, the prime suspect was a man who lived very close to where Alison Rook and Joy Summers lived in Frankston North. He'd lived there for several, 8 to 9 years by this point, like in 1981. And he was brought in for questioning. He was a Christian man, a very, very strong religious man who was heavily involved with his church. He was married with children. He'd also lived previously in an area very close to Tynong North, like basically next to Tynong North, where the 3 women, like Catherine Headland, Bertha Miller, and Anne Marie Sargent were found. He had lived there for a long period of time. He had extremely good knowledge of all of these suburbs and areas around Melbourne. He lived and worked in them. He also worked shift work. He was available during the day. He worked evenings as a projectionist at a cinema, and this cinema was located on Sky Road, which is where, it's just off of McCullen Drive, which is where Alison Rook and Joy Summers' bodies were located. Now, when he's brought in for questioning, he's absolutely adamant he's got nothing to do with anything. He does admit that when he's driving around, if he sees women waiting for public transport or walking down the street looking like they're going to go and get public transport, he offers lifts to them. He also says, though, that he offers lifts to men as well. It's not just women. And police say, why do you do that? Like, why do you drive around offering lifts? Because several witnesses had come forward saying that he, in his car, the black panel van, had in fact approached them. And this is why police had originally brought him in for questioning. Now, he, again, like I said, he lived around the corner in Frankston North. He comes back at the police and he says, I'm just trying to be kind. I'm just trying to be friendly. I feel sorry for people waiting for public transport, like they could be waiting there for quite some time for a bus, etc. And it also gives me someone to talk to whilst I'm driving. Police are like, really? Now, police also say to him, okay, well, were you offering lifts between 1980, so when Alison Rook went missing, the first victim, to like 1981 in October when Joy Summers went missing? And they say to him, you do realise these two women, the first victim and the last, lived around the corner from you? And he's like, well, it's the first I know of it. I didn't know two women were taken and murdered. And they're like, okay, well, they were. And he says, well, I didn't know that. And he says, yeah, I was offering lifts in that 18-month period. And they say, okay, so how many lifts do you think you offered? He says anywhere in excess of 50. How he comes up with that number, I don't know. He says anywhere in excess of 50, and they say, okay, that's fine. So what about what was your success rate? And this is when he has a very interesting answer. He says, I probably ended up, most people say no. Most women especially say no. They don't want to get in the car. But he said, I probably had 6. I probably had 6 women get in my car. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. At the moment, we have 5 bodies. 5 abductions, 5 bodies. We've got Alison Rook, who went missing first. We then have Bertha Miller, who went missing next. We then have Catherine Headland, who went missing. We then have Anne-Marie Sargent, who went missing. And then we have Joy Summers, who went missing. Now, those 3 were found in Tynong North, and the first and the last were found in Frankston North, where he lived. We also have a 6th missing person, though, Nirmal Stevenson, and I'm going to get back into her, and the woman originally from Thailand. She's about to come into play as well. But at the moment, she hasn't been found. Whilst all of this interviewing is going on of this prime suspect, she hasn't been found. But he does say, I picked up 6 women in that whole time. 6 women are missing. 5 have been found murdered. However, police don't have any physical evidence placing him anywhere. They only have all circumstantial evidence on him. The other thing, though, and I honestly believe this is one of the biggest red flags. So they start to ask him about his alibis. He doesn't have an alibi for those times during the day because, of course, he worked evenings. This is when police say to him, so are you familiar with Sky Road and McCullen Drive, where the 2 women were found? And he says, no, I don't know that road at all. Now, when police looked into it, he worked on Sky Road. He worked at a cinema on Sky Road, and he says he doesn't know it at all. That was kind of the first real red flag for police. they said to him, you work and you live around the corner from those two roads and you're saying that you don't know them. And he's like, oh, I didn't know. Now, the other problem, and this is one of the biggest problems for me, I feel, he used to work as a truck driver for the quarry in Tynong North, which is the quarry that is now, by then wasn't in use anymore, where Catherine Headland, Bertha Miller and Anne-Marie Sargent's bodies were found in the bush just next to, right next to where the quarry is. Now, this is such an isolated location, and the fact that he used to work there and drive up and down Bruce Road all the time, as far as for me, knowing that it's not somewhere where someone would just choose to go. And now any of you who watch true crime, you'd know serial killers choose and hunt in areas that they are comfortable and familiar with. They also dispose of bodies in places that they are comfortable with and familiar with and know that people don't go to. So where he had taken the bodies was somewhere that not anyone would have just thought of, but if you worked there and you knew how isolated it was and the chances of anyone going out there was minimal, it was an ideal location. So for me, that was when I was like, this suspect I don't like him. So we're going to then move on. I don't know how you feel about it, but we're going to move it now. It's not to say he's guilty. You can't say someone's guilty. They're innocent till proven guilty, but I can see definitely why he was their prime suspect. And it gets worse. So he lawyers up and tells police he's not going to cooperate with them anymore. However, he's also caught in a lie. He gives an alibi that he was at a bank depositing a check with his wife on one of the days that one of the women disappeared, or when Alison Rook disappeared, I believe it was. And when they checked with the bank, the bank said, no, we don't have any record of him coming in that day. There was no deposit made, no withdrawal made. We would have it on record. And when they looked into it, they said he did make a withdrawal the day before, but that was at a bank, not here at our branch, but at a bank 20 kilometers away. So once again, this prime suspect is caught in a second lie. So the first lie, he said that he didn't know Sky Road and he worked on it. And the second being that he said he had an alibi for one of the days that one of the women went missing, and I believe it was Alison Rook. But it's been proven that it wasn't correct. Even though his wife even backed him up and said that had happened, the bank said, no, it didn't. We would have record of it. Now, he also had very strong religious views, and people who went to church with him said that he was someone who was very against divorce or cheating on your partner. He was also he would get very vocal if someone had any explicit images or pornography of women or anything like that. However, it was also found out by police that he would visit sex workers quite regularly. And when he was questioned on this, because he'd actually been arrested for soliciting a sex worker, he said that, that was back when I was having just some marital problems and I was lonely and I just wanted to cuddle. That's all that happened. We were cuddling. Now, on Thursday, the 3rd of February, 1993, Nirmal Stevenson's body is finally found. Now, this is where her disappearance finally gets linked in with this entire investigation. So she had gone missing in 1980 as well. So she went missing not long after Anne-Marie Sargent had gone missing, but before Joy Summers had gone missing. So Nirmal hadn't been treated as a missing person necessarily. I mean, she was a missing person and it was certainly of concern. But police also had thought that, she'd had a falling out with her husband, so they weren't entirely sure whether she had gone off on her own accord. But what links her in the end to all of the rest of them is that a man is driving along the Princess Freeway and he gets a flat tire. So he pulls over near a service, or directly across from a service station, but right near Bruce Road. Now, Bruce Road is that road that you drive up, which takes you to the quarry, like in Tynong North. So he's in Tynong North on the Princess Freeway, and he has to pull over. His friend who was in the car with him goes over to the service station across the road to try and find like a jack so that they can jack up the car and change the tire. Now, the other man decides to stretch his legs, and he just walks down Bruce Road a little way, and he's about 50 meters away from the highway when he looks down at his feet on the path and sees a bone. Now, this man happened to be a teacher in human anatomy, and he immediately recognized the bone as a human thigh bone and not an animal bone. So he freaks out and goes back to the car, and they call police. Now, police come out, and upon investigating the area, it doesn't take them long to find the rest of the remains of the person, who's, again, basically they're skeletal, they're naked, and through dental records, they identify the person as 34-year-old Normal Stevenson, who had gone missing in 1980 as well in Brunswick after sitting in the car that day. So this is when it's realised Normal's been murdered. Now, where she's been found is Bruce Road in Tynong North, only just a few kilometres away from where the other three women had been found in 1980 as well. So where they'd been found in 1980, a week after she disappeared. That makes you think that whilst police were driving up and down Bruce Road to investigate their murder, Normal was potentially dumped on that road a week beforehand, and her body had been there since. So immediately she's now linked to the other Tynong murders. So Catherine Headland, Bertha Miller, and Anne-Marie Sargent. And of course, police are still linking the Frankston North murders as well of Joyce Summers and Alison Rook. Now, again, upon an autopsy, which unfortunately, they only had like skeletal remains. Cause of death couldn't be established. Sexual assault couldn't be established. But of course, it was foul play like the rest. Now, the coroner did say that he felt it couldn't be proven. He felt potentially the women had either been asphyxiated or stabbed to death, although he couldn't prove it. Now, another thing about this, that before Normal's body had been found, but the other 5 had been, the prime suspect had gone into the police station, and just at his own accord, even though he'd lawyered up previously, he went into the police station and spoke to an investigator and said, "Why am I only being accused of 2 murders?" And they said, "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, I've been accused of Joyce Summers and Alison Rook. Like, why am I only being accused of their murders?" And they were like, "Well, what are you talking about?" And he's like, "What about the bodies in Tynong North that were found? Why am I being accused of those?" And at this stage, only the 3 had been found. Normal's had not been found at this point. And he then says to police, "I should be accused of 6 murders, no?" Now, only 5 bodies had been found at this point. Normal's body had not been found. It wasn't found until 1983. He said 6, not 5. This made police, of course, once Normal's body was found, and it was found in Tynong North, he's either gotten his numbers wrong and said 6 instead of meaning to say 5, or he just dropped himself in it. Now, all of these investigations, all of these task forces, even though they worked tirelessly and for years, everything went cold. No arrests were ever made. None of these 3 suspects, including the prime suspect, has ever been able to be arrested and charged. And the case just kept going cold. Now, it would have new life breathed into it. It felt like every decade they would put another small task force onto it. Family and friends were trying to drive it. The previous police commissioner, who was the nephew of Bertha Miller, he was very vocal about getting this case reopened, and in 1999 it was reopened again. And this time they had hoped to reopen the investigation, pull out all of the evidence, like pull out all of the boxes of evidence, and then retest everything, because of course between 1980 and 1999, big changes and advancements had been made in DNA. So they went and retested everything, but unfortunately no foreign DNA was picked up on any of the evidence that they had. No new witnesses, no new leads, and eventually this investigation goes cold. However, again, in 2017, there was a press conference held where finally they were reopening the case. They were putting a brand new task force onto it. They were now treating the 6 women finally as like one investigation, whereas previously they'd always sort of said Tynong North murders and Frankston North murders. They'd always still talked about them together but still separated them. And that's because a lot of investigators believed that one person had killed the 3 in Tynong North, one had killed the 2 in Frankston North, and then a third had even killed Normal Stevenson and just happened to coincidentally dispose of her in the same or very close to the other 3 in Tynong North. However, a lot of other police just disagreed with that. They were like, no, Normal Stevenson, it's too much of a coincidence that she was really close to the other 3. And they believed that one person was responsible for all of them. And now it's treated like that. With this 2017, it's treated as one investigation. And they've said that as much as there's always been those 3 prime suspects, there's been those 3 suspects with one being the prime, they're starting from scratch. They have restarted everything. They're looking at everything. They're going through all of the statements. However, unfortunately, being close to 40 years on at this point, a lot of the witnesses have passed away or have no way of remembering what their statement was back then. I mean, I can't remember 4 days ago, let alone 40 years. So this was going to make this investigation really tough, but they were like determined that these 6 women can't be forgotten. Their family members and their extended family still want answers. This has haunted them for generations. It's not something you get over, is losing a family member that way. A mother, a grandmother, a sister, a best friend, a girlfriend. Catherine Headland's boyfriend, John, who was 15 at the time, to this day, has never forgiven himself.
Since what happened with Catherine, I'm a changed person. I can get very niggly. Things can upset me, and all my mates will say I'm the sweetest person out, but they'll tell you at other times when I've been at parties and I've got a little bit of drink in me, there's something that just bites me all the time. Something makes me angry, and I started doing things. I got myself covered in tattoos. I started working out in the gym, and I thought, if they actually find this person, I'll hospitalise him. I actually demolished that bus stop a couple of times through pure anger.
It's obvious if I had walked her, she'd be still here today. If there was one thing in life I wish I could change, it'd be that day. Because I walked her everywhere. And it's just one time. Like, I was sick, but I could have made it.
I've gone to just love you, miss you. And
every night?
Yep. For 40 odd years. It gets to the point where you think, where your friends say you're mad. You can't live in the past, John, you've got to move on. I've tried that with several girlfriends, and it's almost like they thought they're the third wheel. There's someone else there, so yeah.
Ever. He's given a couple of interviews and they're heartbreaking. This is what I hate about true crime, is that it's the innocent people, it's the family and the friends who end up feeling guilty and not the perpetrator. It's family and friends who are left going coulda, shoulda, woulda, not the perpetrator. Family and friends are the ones who serve the life sentences and the victims. Now, another development has also happened. Last year in 2020, the prime suspect at 88 years old passed away. I don't know how he passed away, but his family and grandchildren wrote in the obituary that he would be sadly missed, that he was a good man. And up until 2020, he still absolutely defended his innocence. He said that he never abducted any women. And in 2017, when they reopened the investigation, which is still going now, this investigation is still open as we speak. So he spoke to the media openly and came out for the first time and publicly spoke. He broke his silence and said to the media that he was really, he couldn't believe that he was still suspected. He has never assaulted or harmed anybody. He just worked hard back then. It has nothing to do with him, and he said that he hoped they solved it eventually and soon. So the other two suspects, as far as I know, are still alive. However, police, like I said, in 2017 said that they were wiping the slate clean. And of course, they're going to look at those three suspects, but they were going to start from scratch and reinvestigate. And that's where we are at today. Sadly, very, very sadly, this is still unsolved. I don't like unsolved. It frustrates me. I know it probably frustrates you too with unsolved cases. It leaves you feeling, but imagine how families feel. This is why you need to cover unsolved, because this is now, once again, since 2017, an active investigation. So I'm hoping someday some physical evidence will come up. So I guess what I'm hoping for is that someone is still sitting on information. Someone knows something. A lot of the time, family members have said that they believe someone knows something. But also, I'm hoping that there's some physical evidence out there that is found. Like maybe the perpetrator still has some of the belongings of the victims, and that would immediately break this case wide open. So here's hoping that this case is one day solved very soon. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I know this was another long video. It was difficult to make it a short one. 6 victims, a lot of information. Please like and subscribe if you found this case interesting. Next week, I'm going to cover Raymond Edmonds, who I talked about before. He's the second suspect of the 6 women we've just talked about. So I'm going to be talking about him next week. It's not going to be a good one. He's horrible. So yeah, but I thought because I mentioned him in this video, maybe it would be quite good to sort of just follow up on him next week. I've got a handful of subscribers. I've got a couple of new ones. Thank you so much. It means a lot to me that you're supporting me. I'm just starting out. I'm going to work on getting my videos to be better. I've had a couple of people give me some feedback, which I really, really appreciate. Constructive feedback's great. Tell me how you feel about this case. Tell me what you think. What do you think? Was it one person? Was it 2? Was it 3 perpetrators? Discuss it with each other. Support the channel, and please take care. Be safe out there, and I will see you all next week. Okay? Bye.